They were led into a dark room, told to sit, told to be quiet, told to watch, but no one explained what they were about to see. And when the lights went out and the screen came alive with moving faces, voices, laughter, and music, something inside them froze because this was not propaganda, not interrogation, not punishment, and not captivity in the form they understood. And the confusion did not come from the images, but from the feeling that this moment did not belong in a prison, did not belong in a war, and did not belong in the life of a prisoner. And the question that formed in their minds was not what the movie was about, but what kind of place allows prisoners to sit in the dark and watch the world of free people? And what happens to the mind when captivity suddenly looks like normal life? The space itself did not look like a place of confinement. And that was the first thing that unsettled them, because there were no visible chains, no harsh commands, no weapons raised in their direction, no shouting voices, and no signs of force, but only a simple room with rows of chairs, a blank wall, a strange machine at the back, and a quiet atmosphere that felt closer to a community hall than to anything they associated with imprisonment. And this contrast alone began to disturb the internal logic they carried about what captivity was supposed to look like. They entered slowly, not with fear, but with uncertainty, because fear is a reaction to known threats, and this space did not present itself as a threat at all. And when the mind cannot identify danger, it does not relax. It becomes alert in a different way, searching for meaning rather than escape, interpreting rather than preparing for impact. And this shift in psychological posture made every detail feel heavier, every sound feel louder, and every movement feel more significant than it should have been. The chairs were ordinary, not restraints, not benches, not hard surfaces meant to punish the body, but simple seats that belonged to a civilian world. And the walls were plain, not marked by authority or warning, and the room itself carried no symbols of power, no flags, no signs of domination, no visible hierarchy. And this absence of control symbols created a strange internal confusion, because the mind of a prisoner is trained to read space as power, to see architecture as authority, and to interpret every structure as a form of control. And here there was nothing to interpret. They sat without understanding the meaning of what they were participating in, not knowing whether this was a test, a demonstration, a psychological exercise, or a form of manipulation, because the act itself did not explain itself. And when actions do not carry clear meaning, the mind fills the gap with suspicion, not trust. And this suspicion did not attach itself to any single person, but to the entire situation, to the environment, to the experience itself, because nothing about it aligned with their internal model of captivity. The darkness came slowly, not abruptly, and when the lights dimmed, the room did not feel threatening, but unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is more destabilizing than fear, because fear gives direction, while unfamiliarity removes orientation. And as the room darkened, the sense of being watched did not intensify, but disappeared, because attention shifted away from them and toward the front of the room. And this alone created a psychological shift, because prisoners are conditioned to exist under observation. And when observation disappears, the mind loses one of its primary reference points. Then the wall changed, not physically, but in meaning, as light appeared where there had been nothing, movement where there had been stillness, sound where there had been silence. And suddenly the room was no longer a room, but a window into another world, a world of faces, streets, houses, voices, laughter, music, and everyday life. And this transformation created a deep internal contradiction, because this was not information, not instruction, not propaganda, and not control, but entertainment, a concept that had no place in their understanding of captivity. What disturbed them most was not the content of what they were seeing, but the act of seeing it at all, because this experience belonged to civilians, to families, to free people, to ordinary life, and not to prisoners of war. And when the mind is placed inside an experience that does not match its identity, it begins to fracture internally, because identity depends on context, and context defines meaning, and meaning defines self. And here the context no longer supported the identity of prisoner in any clear way. They were no longer soldiers and not civilians and not free men and not fully prisoners in the psychological sense they had known, but something undefined, sitting in a space that did not behave like a prison and watching a world that did not belong to them. And this in-between state created a quiet psychological tension that did not express itself as fear or anger, but as confusion, because the mind could not locate itself inside the situation. Their bodies were still, their eyes fixed on the moving images, but internally there was a growing distance between who they believed they were and what they were experiencing, because the self cannot easily exist inside contradiction without changing. And this was the first moment where the experience of captivity stopped being defined by physical restriction and began to be defined by psychological displacement, because they were no longer trapped only by walls, but by a reality that no longer made sense in relation to who they believed themselves to be. This was not the beginning of comfort, and not the beginning of acceptance, and not the beginning of trust, but the beginning of disorientation. Because when a prisoner is allowed to participate in ordinary human experiences, the mind loses its clear structure of opposition. And when opposition disappears, identity loses its foundation. And when identity loses its foundation, the self begins to drift. And that drift began here, in a simple room without bars, where captivity no longer looked like a prison and freedom appeared only as light on a wall. As the images continued to move across the screen, the room itself seemed to disappear from their awareness, not because it vanished physically, but because their attention was slowly pulled into a reality that felt distant, unreachable, and deeply unsettling, since what they were seeing did not belong to their lives, their past, or their present. And yet it was being placed directly in front of them, as if it were something they were meant to witness, understand, and emotionally process. And this created a strange internal tension where the mind did not know whether to engage or withdraw. The faces on the screen did not look like enemies, and they did not look like soldiers, and they did not look like guards, but like ordinary people living ordinary lives, moving through streets, sitting in homes, laughing, arguing, working, loving, and existing inside a world that felt stable, familiar, and complete. And this stability created a quiet psychological pain, not sharp and dramatic, but heavy and internal, because it reminded them of a world that continued to function without them. A world that did not pause for war, captivity, or suffering. And this realization made their own existence feel suspended, disconnected from the flow of real life. They were not shocked by the technology, and not overwhelmed by the sound, and not confused by the language as much as they were unsettled by the normality. Because normality is the most powerful form of contrast, and when normal life is placed in front of a prisoner, it does not create envy first, but dislocation, a feeling of being out of place in reality itself. Because the mind suddenly becomes aware that it exists outside the natural rhythm of the world it is watching. This created a quiet internal separation, where they no longer felt fully present in the room, and no longer fully present in the world on the screen, but suspended between two realities belonging to neither. And this psychological suspension produced a feeling of weightlessness, where identity felt less solid, less defined, and less anchored, because identity depends on belonging, and belonging requires a place in the world, And in that moment, they did not feel like they belonged anywhere. The sound of laughter did not feel comforting, and the music did not feel joyful, because those sounds belonged to a world of continuity, a world where life moved forward naturally. And continuity is painful to those whose lives have been interrupted, because it highlights the rupture in their own existence, the break in their personal timeline, the pause in their personal narrative. And this contrast made their own lives feel like fragments rather than stories, moments rather than journeys. They began to feel a subtle emotional distance from their own memories because the world on the screen did not connect to their past in any meaningful way, and it did not connect to their present either. And this created a psychological gap where memory, identity, and reality no longer align because the self is built from continuity, and continuity had been broken by war and captivity, and now that break was being silently reinforced by watching a world that had not been broken at all. What made the experience unsettling was not that they were watching something pleasant, but that they were watching something whole, something intact, something uninterrupted, because wholeness exposes fragmentation. And when a fragmented self encounters a whole world, it becomes aware of its own incompleteness. And this awareness does not produce anger, but sadness, not resistance, but silence, not protest, but withdrawal. Because the mind retreats when it cannot reconcile reality with identity. They did not speak and they did not react outwardly, and they did not move, but inside there was a growing sense of emotional stillness, a quiet shutting down of internal response, because the mind cannot process too much contradiction without protecting itself. And the simplest form of protection is detachment. And this detachment began to form not as indifference, but as psychological distance, a separation between what they were seeing and what they were feeling. This was the stage where the experience stopped being about captivity and started being about existence itself, because the question was no longer about freedom or imprisonment, but about belonging, continuity, and meaning. And when those foundations weaken, the self becomes unstable, and instability does not always look like chaos, but often looks like quietness, emptiness, and emotional flattening. By the time the images continued to flow across the screen, the prisoners were no longer watching a movie in the normal sense, but witnessing a reality they could not enter, a life they could not touch, and a world they could not belong to. And that realization began to reshape their internal relationship with their own existence. Because once the mind accepts that it is separate from the flow of life itself, it begins to detach not only from the world, but from the self as well. And this detachment marked the beginning of a deeper psychological transformation that would continue long after the room filled with light again. When the images continued and the story on the screen moved forward, something inside them began to withdraw, not suddenly and not violently, but slowly and quietly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, because the mind had reached a point where it could no longer emotionally integrate what it was witnessing. And when integration becomes impossible, separation becomes necessary. And this separation did not happen between them and the screen, but between them and themselves. They were still sitting in the room, still watching, still hearing the sounds and voices and music, but internally, there was a growing distance between their awareness and their emotions, because the experience no longer felt like something happening to them, but like something happening in front of them, separate from their inner world. And this psychological distancing became a form of protection, because the human mind instinctively creates distance when reality becomes too complex to process without losing stability. Their thoughts began to slow, not because they were calm, but because their minds were no longer trying to interpret meaning. And when the search for meaning stops, the mind enters a passive state where it observes without engagement and receives without response. And this passivity did not feel peaceful, but empty, because engagement is what gives experiences emotional weight. And without engagement, reality becomes flat, distant, and unreal. They started to feel disconnected not only from the images on the screen, but from their own memories because the world being shown did not connect to their past, and their past did not connect to their present, and their present did not connect to the future. And this break in continuity created a psychological gap where identity could no longer form a coherent narrative because identity depends on story, and story depends on continuity, and continuity had been fractured by war, captivity, and now by this silent confrontation with a world that moved forward without them. This internal disconnection created a strange sensation of emotional lightness, where feelings no longer carried weight and thoughts no longer carried urgency. Because urgency requires purpose, and purpose requires direction, and direction requires a future, and the future had become abstract, distant, and undefined. And when the future loses its shape, the present loses its meaning. And when meaning disappears, the mind begins to float in a state of psychological suspension. They were no longer emotionally reacting to the film and no longer internally responding to the environment, because response requires attachment, and attachment had begun to dissolve, replaced by a quiet neutrality that did not feel like acceptance, but like absence, because acceptance still contains emotion, while absence contains nothing but stillness. This stillness did not feel safe, and it did not feel threatening, but empty, because it lacked direction, structure, and reference. And without reference points, the mind cannot orient itself. And when the mind cannot orient itself, it stops trying. And this surrender of orientation marked a deeper shift because it meant that their inner world was no longer organized around survival, resistance, or hope, but around maintenance, stability, and psychological containment. They began to exist internally in a reduced state, where emotions were smaller, reactions were slower, and thoughts were simpler, because complexity had become exhausting. And when complexity becomes exhausting, the mind chooses simplicity, even if that simplicity means emotional numbness and psychological distance, because numbness is easier to carry than contradiction. By this stage, the experience had stopped being about a movie and had become about internal transformation, because the true change was happening inside their perception, not in the room, not on the screen, and not in the environment, but in the structure of their inner world, where the self was slowly detaching from meaning, from narrative, and from emotional depth. They were no longer prisoners reacting to captivity, but individuals adapting to a reality that no longer had clear definition. And this adaptation did not produce rebellion and did not produce despair, but produced quiet withdrawal, where the mind pulled inward, reduced its engagement with the world, and began to exist in a smaller psychological space. Because when the world becomes too complex to understand, the mind simplifies itself to survive, and this simplification marked the beginning of a deeper internal shift where identity itself began to lose its sharp edges and its clear boundaries, dissolving slowly into a state of psychological neutrality that would shape everything that followed. As their inner distance continued to grow, the outside world began to feel less solid. Not because it disappeared, but because its emotional weight had changed. And when emotional weight changes, reality itself begins to feel different, lighter, less anchored, less immediate. And this shift created a strange psychological effect where the environment no longer felt fully real in the way it once had, because the mind was no longer fully present inside it. The room, the screen, the sound, and the people around them continued to exist physically, but psychologically they began to feel distant, as if separated by an invisible barrier that did not block vision but blocked connection. because connection requires emotional engagement, and emotional engagement had begun to fade, replaced by internal withdrawal and psychological self-containment. And this created a state where existence was experienced without depth, without intensity, and without strong internal response. They no longer felt fully trapped, but they also did not feel free, because both concepts had lost their emotional clarity. And when concepts lose clarity, they lose power. And when they lose power, they stop shaping behavior and identity. And this is how captivity began to lose its psychological definition, not because the physical conditions had changed, but because the mental interpretation of those conditions had shifted. The future no longer felt urgent, and the past no longer felt close, and the present no longer felt meaningful, because time itself had begun to flatten, losing its structure, its direction, and its emotional pull. And when time loses its structure, identity loses its narrative, because the self is built from memory, expectation, and continuity. And when those collapse into a continuous present, the self begins to dissolve into a state of suspended existence. They started to live more in routine than in intention, more in habit than in purpose, and more in stability than in meaning. Because routine offers psychological safety when meaning becomes unstable, and safety becomes more important than freedom when the mind is exhausted. And this exhaustion was not physical, but cognitive, emotional, and psychological. Because the constant effort to interpret a contradictory reality had slowly drained their internal energy. This is where the deepest form of adaptation began, because adaptation no longer meant learning how to survive, but learning how to exist without internal conflict. And this required the mind to reduce its emotional range, reduce its reactions, reduce its expectations, and reduce its sense of urgency, creating a quieter, smaller inner world that was easier to maintain, but less alive. They were no longer mentally resisting the system, and no longer mentally questioning it, and no longer mentally opposing it. Because opposition requires energy, and energy had been redirected towards psychological stability rather than psychological change. And this shift marked a crucial transformation, where captivity stopped being an experience to endure and became a condition to manage. The environment no longer felt hostile, but it also no longer felt meaningful, because meaning had been replaced by predictability, and predictability creates calm, but also emptiness, because calm without purpose becomes stillness, and stillness without meaning becomes psychological silence. And this silence became the dominant internal state, where emotions were present but muted, thoughts were present but distant, and existence was present but detached. By this stage, the prison no longer needed to assert itself, because it had become internalized. And once something is internalized, it no longer feels like control, it feels like reality. And when control feels like reality, it no longer triggers resistance. And this is how captivity reached its most subtle form, not through force, not through fear, and not through violence, but through quiet psychological adaptation, where the world no longer felt fully real, and the self no longer felt fully present inside it. By the time this inner transformation reached its final stage, the struggle that once defined their existence had almost completely disappeared, not because it had been defeated, but because it had slowly lost its meaning. And when meaning disappears, effort disappears with it, because the mind no longer knows what it is supposed to fight for. And without a clear object of resistance, resistance itself dissolves into silence. They no longer experience captivity as something that demanded emotional reaction, because emotional reaction requires contrast, and contrast requires extremes, and their world no longer felt extreme in any direction, neither brutally violent nor genuinely free, but suspended in a psychological middle space where nothing felt intense enough to provoke strong feeling and nothing felt meaningful enough to demand change. And this emotional neutrality became the final structure of their inner world. Hope did not vanish dramatically, but faded quietly, because hope needs a future that feels different from the present, and the present no longer felt unbearable enough to require a different future. And when the present becomes tolerable, even inside captivity, the mind stops projecting itself forward. And when the mind stops projecting itself forward, time collapses into a continuous present where existence becomes repetitive, stable, and emotionally flat. Their inner lives became organized around routine rather than purpose, around predictability rather than meaning, and around stability rather than freedom. Because stability reduces psychological tension, and when tension disappears, the energy for change disappears with it. And this shift did not feel like surrender, but like calm, a calm that did not bring peace, but silence, because peace contains fulfillment, while silence contains absence. The memory of who they had been before captivity no longer felt painful, but distant, like a story belonging to someone else, because identity adapts to the environment it lives in, and over time the environment becomes the dominant reference point for the self. And when that happens, the old identity loses its emotional weight, and the new identity forms without intention, without choice, and without awareness. This was the quiet end of resistance, not marked by defeat, not marked by collapse, and not marked by despair, but by psychological accommodation, with a mind no longer opposed a system, no longer questioned it, and no longer tried to change it, but learned to exist inside it with minimal internal conflict, because conflict had become too exhausting to sustain. They had not been broken by violence, and they had not been crushed by fear, and they had not been destroyed by suffering, but they had been reshaped by adaptation, by normalization, and by the slow internal restructuring of meaning, where captivity stopped being defined by walls and started being defined by perception. And once perception changes, reality follows. By the end of this process, captivity no longer needed to impose itself because it had become internal. And when captivity becomes internal, it no longer feels like a prison, it feels like life. And that is the most complete form of confinement because it does not feel like loss, it does not feel like oppression, and it does not feel like control, but like normal existence where the self grows quiet. The mind becomes still, and resistance fades not through force, but through silence. When the lights returned and the room slowly filled with sound and movement again, nothing had changed in the physical world, and yet everything had shifted inside their perception, because what remained was not the memory of the film, not the faces on the screen, and not the story itself, but the quiet psychological displacement it created, where captivity no longer felt like a simple condition of walls and rules, but like a mental state shaped by contradiction, normalization, and emotional distance. This experience did not transform them through fear, and it did not reshape them through suffering, but through exposure to a world they could not enter, a normal life they could not belong to, and a reality that continued without them. And this separation slowly altered how they understood themselves, their identity, and their place in the world, because the mind does not only suffer from pain, it also erodes from disconnection. What remained was not anger, not rebellion, and not despair, but a quiet internal shift where resistance lost its urgency, identity lost its clarity, and meaning lost its sharp edges, and captivity stopped being defined by force and started being defined by psychological adaptation. In the end, the most powerful change did not happen on the screen, and it did not happen in the room, but inside the mind itself, because when a prisoner is allowed to touch fragments of normal life without being allowed to belong to it, the self does not break loudly. It grows quiet. And in that quietness, identity reshapes, meaning dissolves, and captivity continues not as a place, but as a state of mind. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.